Hey, so you found chapter 8, the social self in cultural context, which is part of the lecture for the Northeastern classes and theories of personality. Um, Hopefully, you'll be able to follow along with your own PowerPoints and with the textbook. If you would like, feel free to tweet questions at me um, or bring them up, obviously, in class. And what else should I tell you? That's it. So there's going to be a number of links in the box below the video. After you watch the video, or if you want during the video, you can flip over to watch some of those links. I had originally done this, but because of copyright stuff, I had to take those out of the actual presentation, so you'll have to click on them on your own as we go. But let's go ahead and start. So chapter 8 is the first one that has really shifted into the social zone for us. If we look at the star placement, it's in the social zone in the upper right-hand corner. It is a macro theory, so we know that these are going to be big overarching types of dynamics. And it's also slightly on the other side. You're going to see in this particular chapter that there's a lot of remnants of the psychoanalytic, and that's why these theories are often called neo-Freudians. They take a lot of Freud's ideas and embellish them and add to them. But basically, and so because of that, there's going to be a lot of times when this is about the individual processing and making choices themselves, creating relationships. So in that way, it's agentic. But because Erikson and Adler do take into consideration the real world people, the people who are really out there, we have to say that they are somewhat other related as well. So that's why the star is in the social zone, and keep that in mind as we go through the chapters. So most of you probably have heard of Erik Erikson before, and his psychosocial stages, which we're going to take a look at. But just in a brief background history, he was friends with Peter Bloss, who's a very well-known author on adolescent development. If you ever take an adolescent development course, you'll probably come across his name. He was actually trained by Anna Freud, who was Sigmund's daughter. And he went to, but he didn't actually complete Harvard. But that didn't stop him from becoming a very important psychologist. He worked at Yale. He actually worked with Margaret Mead in South Dakota. So he had a really diverse kind of background. And with some of that, you can almost begin to hear, especially Margaret Mead, the focus on culture and the focus on things outside of the self. So again, star placement out in the social zone. The parts of personality for Erikson are very similar to the other parts that we've talked about with the classic psychoanalytic. So here's the beginning of some of those connections, and again, why we call them a neo-Freudian. The id really for Erikson is very much the same as Freud's id. It was the animal part of us. It's the most basic elements of our nature and survival. He reworded and slightly changed superego and ego. And really, both of those focus for him much more on the real world than in the Freudian classic psychoanalytic model. So if you look at the top of the slide where it says it's a mutually regulating self, it implies that there's something out in the real world, in the social world, that really is interacting more directly with the inside world. Whereas in the Freudian model, the inside world, the agentic self reigns supreme, and even things that were coming in from, let's say when we were talking about the superego with Freud, we said there's elements of the self that are actually determining what comes in and what gets rejected from character. So keep that in mind. It's a mutual regulation. There really is a dyad between the person and the outside world. So mutual regulation is this reciprocal and complementary interpersonal exchange. Erikson really felt that developing character is always a balancing act. He used a lot of these polarities. So again, people are familiar with his psychosocial stages, might remember trust versus mistrust, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, etc., etc., etc. And he felt that that just went across the lifespan. If you remember, again, just to make comparisons, in the Freudian theory, character is pretty much set, personality was set by age 5 and through the oral, anal, and phallic stages. For Erikson, development occurred throughout the lifespan. So well into your 90s, you may actually end up going backwards through some of his original 8 stages, and we'll talk about how he is thought to have altered his theory at the end of his life. Erikson did not directly refer to repetition compulsions like we talked about with Freud, the kind of habits that we fall into, but he did talk about ritualizations, reoccurring patterns of behavior that reflect values, customs, and belief of a particular culture that make life meaningful. So we can think of, in the Jewish tradition, things like bar mitzvah and bar mitzvahs, in other types, like say in Catholicism, First Holy Communion, confirmation, that there are certain rituals that come from the outside, the social zone, which impact the self. So that's kind of really important and key. Again, gives us a little bit of clue as to why the star is in the social zone. Comparing Erikson and Freud again, Erikson was much less concerned about how things started. So this idea of studying the origins of things, or ornology, and more into an epigenetic principle. There are elements of earlier stages found in later. If you do a Google search, and I'll add this link to the bottom for the Waddington's landscape, you get the idea that if you can imagine a ball rolling down a hill, that would kind of be a straight line if it was just a straight hill. But let's say that going down that hill, there's a specific river that has cut out a trench. And so if a ball rolling down the hill gets into that trench, it's more likely to stay in that trench unless there's a bump, or let's say a tree gets blocking it, and in which case it may bounce out and go back onto another path. So an epigenetic principle for Erikson is that things that happen, i.e. falling into that ditch, is going to impact where the ball is rolling in the future. This will make more sense when we start talking about his particular stages. So I'm going to skip for a moment to his stages just to give you that. Trust versus mistrust. If you end up, the healthier thing for Erikson is to have some sense of trust in the world, not complete trust. We don't want to have absolutely complete trust and just kind of throw all caution to the wind. That wouldn't be safe. But more on the trust side than on the mistrust side. If we were to say, for instance, fall on the mistrust side in stage 1, in stage 2, then we're going in with that kind of impacting us, and so it might impact how we come out of stage 2, and then that might impact how we come out of stage 3, 4, 5, go on and on and on and on. Similarly, if we're in, let's say, the school years, what we were before calling the latent years between 6 and 12, we're working on industry versus inferiority, and then all of a sudden there's some kind of trauma that shakes us back to our core beginning elements of trust and mistrust, and all of a sudden now we're on the mistrust side. Then going forward, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are going to be impacted because of that trauma. So for Erikson, these are not discrete stages that once you're done with, you never go back to. You're always kind of weaving in and out of his 8 stages. Okay, I want to go back for a moment to talk about setting up these psychosocial stages. For Erikson, there was a biological component. How you're born may actually impact your character in terms of male and femaleness. So he's obviously a social person. He understands gender as a social construct and that that's going to impact us. But he also talks about anatomy sometimes being destiny. So for instance, this particular sand tray piece that was created by a patient of mine, I think it was created by a male or a female. Notice that there's a lot of organization, things are very neat, it's an enclosure where things are being held in the middle. This particular image was actually created by a female, and we're going to see that's kind of what Erikson would have predicted. He did a study where he basically asked kids to construct these scenes, imaginary scenes. And first off, I thought this was really interesting. Um, the kids did not just do stuff from previous um, movies that they'd seen or stories. They really, for the most part, created original types of scenes. Um, but why did he find that boys and girls themes seemed to be different? What he basically found was that girls typically created enclosures that sometimes had an elaborate entrance and contained elements such as people and animals. They tended to be static and peaceful, although sometimes the dangerous animals and men sometimes broke into the scenes. But think of, let's go back and look at that enclosure again. The stacked kind of can looking like things in the back there was the gate, so that's very elaborate. And all these balls are connected and safe inside the enclosure. Boys, to the contrary, created really high walls and then had many objects like towers and cannons protruding from them, so phallic type symbols for Erikson. When you're hearing that, make sure you're hearing also the classic psychoanalytic ideas. The scenes created by boys had relatively more animals outside the enclosure. The boys' scenes were dynamic and included fantasies about the collapse or downfall of their creation. And Erikson concluded that the scenes created by children were outward manifestations of their genital apparatus. It was so reliable, Erikson was surprised and often uneasy whenever he found a kid that did not actually do this. So, for instance, compare this picture of a Santré art with the one that we were looking at first. When he talks about dynamic, you can see this is not a peaceful looking scene. You can tell things have been destroyed. There's nothing that's really encased or enclosed. There's no box. There's no fort. It's just very active and a lot of all over the place. So when I was doing this, the guy just let the kids create this. I didn't actually make them tell them to do any of the things that they did. I just happened to have these photos, and when I was reading about Erikson, I was like, oh, these are actually exactly what Erikson would have predicted. So there you go. Okay, let's jump back into his stages. So we've got this element that is biological, similar to Freud's ideas about that there is a start of a biological element to all of this. But then we quickly go into things that are going to be impacted by how we grow up and our experiences in the world and all these psychosocial pieces. So he has 8 stages that he's really most well known for that go all the way from the first year of life into old age. Each of the stages gives you some kind of virtue and has a challenge that goes along with it. Whenever we do developmental theory, and as we continue to introduce some of these with other people, keep in the back of your mind that we're really talking about something that generally happens at a certain age, but some kids take longer to go through a stage. Some kids regress and revisit. Even adults can go back and revisit. And I kind of gave an example of how if something really bad were to happen in the 4th or 5th stage, maybe around 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, it can make you go back and rethink how you came out of trust and reprocess and feel how you came out of trust. So these stages are certainly there for you to review. There's a great film that came out in 1975, 76 called Everyone Rides the Carousel. It's this great little cartoon. I'll include some links so you can watch elements of it. The entire video isn't available online, but I do have a copy of it if you're interested in watching it on your own. And the video does a really good job of showing how stages all interrelate with one another. At the end of Erikson's life, he had the idea that maybe we should be revisiting the original stages, and that instead of actually going through, for example, the first one was trust versus mistrust. Later on in our life, after age 90, as we go through gerotranscendence, we might go through them and actually end up on the other side. So for instance, where initially we had trust in the world and trust in ourselves, we felt a sense of industry and getting things done and initiative, we may later on kind of begin to mistrust our body. We may feel somewhat inferior, and we may actually re-experience role confusion as we're not 100% sure what we should be doing at this particular point in our life. So he rethought it. He died before he published anything, but um, other people have kind of talked about this idea in his life and in his work. And so it's an interesting idea. What does happen when we hit that particular age? I'm going to let you read through this on your own. Um, Not as important, but you can see the way that as we go through the stages, there's multiple levels. They're much more complicated. If this was a development course, we'd probably spend a little bit more time here, but there's always these polarities. There's always these um, parts of our character that are being formed. These are critical windows. It's not the only time that this can be uh, dealt with, but these are the common times that Erikson found people to be dealing with a particular challenge. The last one here in generativity on this particular slide, I like to sometimes help people think about, even if you're not 25 to 64 yet, things that you're doing now are probably going to lead you to become more of a generative type of person versus being totally self-absorbed and perhaps maybe more narcissistic. So for example, if you looked at these lists and counted how many of these do you think you're currently working on or working towards, it might give you a sense of how, even if you're not in the generativity stage yet, you're getting there. So being committed to groups and activities, volunteering for charities, many of you probably do that kind of thing. Probably most of you don't have children or think about adopting, but you have an idea that one day you might like to have a family. You might have the idea that one day you want to teach important skills or feel needed by others. So as you're looking at this list and thinking, oh yeah, I'm doing some of these things now, it helps us understand that even though we haven't hit the stage of generativity versus self-absorption, they are still in us and they're still part of our character. So that pretty much sums up Erikson and what we're going to talk about. Make sure that you watch the links below for Erikson, and we'll start talking a little bit now about Alfred Adler, who's another neo-Freudian. Another one, actually, Adler was very, very close to Freud, and because he had different theories and ideas from Freud, ends up getting kicked out from the inner circle. And Adler became really interested. One of the things he's probably most well known for is birth order and his ideas around birth order. So let's talk about Adler. Think about your own birth. If you're a firstborn or an onlyborn, are you a middleborn or are you a lastborn? Are you the baby of the family? If you have, this gets more complicated in our time. If you have more than 7 years between you and the sibling, then you're really in a separate birth order. So if all of your siblings are over 10, let's say 8, 9, 10 years older than you, then you're actually an only child. If you have a sibling that is maybe 10 years younger than you, then you probably are the last born and that other child is an only child. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this. And then think about, on a scale of 1 to 7, how much you feel that you follow the rules or are a rebel. If we were in class live, I'd have you doing this, but since we're not, I'm just letting you know the firstborns and only children tend to be much more rule followers, and the later borns tend to be the ones who are more rebellious. And I'm going to ask you to watch a link. Frank Sulloway, who wrote a book, Born to Rebel, which is from Viacom. And in that video, you'll hear him talking about all the ways in which characters develop niches. And one of the thoughts here is that, if you're the firstborn or an onlyborn, you've only got adults surrounding you. You're going to learn language quicker. You're going to do a lot of adult things that perhaps a later born would have you and other siblings perhaps, so they're not only hearing adult language. And that's going to do things like, in the video, they talk about impacting intelligence scores. So watch that video below on Frank Sulloway, and then we'll continue on with the slides. So at this point, you should have watched that video. paused this and watched it. If you haven't, pause it, go watch it now. But Adler, want to be cautious here. Adler was not a big fan of types. He didn't want to put people into specific categories like this because he really felt like you lose individual uniqueness. With that said, though, he did kind of generate these ideas about different types of people. So, for example, he talked about the getting and learning type, who take selfishly without ever giving back, the avoiding type, who just hate being defeated, so as a result, they only do things that are very low risk, the dominant or the ruling type, who strive for power, and then finally the socially useful type, people who are outgoing, very active, usually have a lot of social contacts, strive to make changes for the good. Adler said, again, similar to where we were talking about with Erikson stages, you can come in and out of these different types, but that usually they're formed in early childhood and become part of your style of life, how you live your life. Right off the bat, that should be part of the idea that connects him to classic psychoanalytic ideas, because we see that formed in childhood, right? So I've bolded some words here that also help you connect this to um, help you connect this to help you connect this to some of the psychoanalytic Freudian roots. The blueprint, the style of life that we have, is an unconscious and repetitive way of responding to friends, love, work, etc. The style is rooted in childhood prototypes, consistent through life, unless it's changed by some kind of really depth psychotherapy, like a psychoanalysis. The style of life is reflected in the unity of an individual's way of thinking, feeling, and acting, often bending an individual away from the needs of others or common sense. Movements are made to relieve inferiority feelings and to compensate for those. So depending on when you're watching this, if we haven't talked about Anna Freud's defense mechanisms, we will, but you can see Adler is influenced by the idea of an ego defense protecting itself. And if you have an experience, a feeling of inferiority, you defensively may try to compensate from it. Very often we use this in our everyday language. We'll talk about somebody saying, oh, look, they are weak in that area and they're overcompensating in another area. This is an example of that. And it really is related to Adler, who studied it probably the most. So that's out there for you. Classical Adlerian psychotherapy tries to help dissolve archaic styles of life and create more creative ways of approaching and thinking about life. The video that you watched of Frank Sulloway, the link is in the PowerPoint if you want to go and click over to it, is really think about the McCrae-Costa 5-factor model. A lot of it shows that there seems to be consistent firstborn, middleborn, and lastborn scores on that 5-factor model. But there are a lot of critics. Think about Judith Rich-Harris, Steven Pinker, when we were talking about them. They say that, the family home does not impact character. Adler saying the opposite. So here Adler saying it clearly is impacted by your sibling birth order. So, there's always debate. There's always two sides to these arguments. We're not going to be able to determine which one is correct, but I just throw it out there that Adler thought yes, Judith Rich-Harris, Steven Pinker thought no. In previous classes, I've asked people to tell me their birth order and then to also correlate that with rebellion rates. And as you can see, it's about an average. It doesn't actually get very highly significant in this particular class. Again, we would have called our own class data, but 22% of firsts and only borns did score low rebellion, 2 to 4, but that also means then that another 75%, 78% scored higher on it than low rebellion. And the second part to this is actually a little bit more accurate, a little bit more interesting, a little bit more significant, although not clinically significant since we don't have enough responses. But that those who scored relatively high in rebellion, 6s, 7s, and 8s, did tend to be the youngest. 50% who scored youngest. So take that for what it's worth. Some of these theories hold more water, some don't. If we were to ask Dr. Quinn to do some analysis and correlational data here using SPSS, he might be able to find out how significant the data actually is. So maybe we'll run that idea past him. So what is the characteristics, some of the other characteristics of each of the borns? Firstborns, because they're firstborn, get all the attention. Probably parents are also more anxious if it's their first child. So the firstborns tend to be more competitive. They have a striving for power in terms of a style for life. Think about it, they've also been dethroned, right? For a while, they are the only child, and then subsequent children come on and take that seat of being the special one, the cared for one, the one that gets carried around. Secondborn, middleborns, most likely one to be competitive, though. They are very many times revolutionaries. Interestingly enough, Adler was a secondborn. The lastborns, or the babies, tend to be the ones who are pampered, and they may attempt to surpass older siblings, but they're often very comfortable in their role as the youngest, and they're very comfortable being taken care of. Many times in relationships, there have been some studies where there is a link between oldest and babies being good in relationships because they carry the dynamics well, the one who is the caretaker and the one who likes to be taken care of. Only children are often pampered, but usually not competitive because they were never dethroned, whereas the firstborn had to deal with subsequent children. The only children never had that, so the competitive doesn't get activated as much in them. Keep in mind what I mentioned earlier, some of this is also based on you have to actually have grown up with that other sibling around for the significant early years of your life. So if there's more than a 7-year difference, you probably were not impacted by that particular sibling. So eliminate them from the dynamic and reconsider your birth order. Adler thought that we were out in the social zone striving for a community, striving to make things better in the world. So this again helps us understand why the star is in the social zone. Kind of already mentioned, besides birth order, the thing that he's probably most well known for would be his ideas about inferiority, the inferiority complex, and that we have a tendency to compensate areas that we're weak by creating areas that we are stronger and better at. A lot of this is pretty self-explanatory, and you can read on your own. So what are the parts for personality for Adler? The inferiority complex is a part. Somebody's style of life is a part. That there is this kind of goal leading things forward, and that we are processing in a dyadic way with somebody else out there how we actually feel and think. The law of movement is helping pull us along. We have a certain creative power. We have a desire to make the world a better place, according to Adler. This begins to hint at some of the humanistic stuff that we're going to talk about in the third part of the course. And that even fictional goals can sometimes provide motivation. So they might not be real. They're what he calls as-if goals. I'm living as if I'm blah, blah, blah. So it can be negative if you say, I'm living as if I'm rich, even though I don't have a lot of money, but it can also be really powerful. I'm living as if I know what I'm doing and I'm going to fake it till I make it. Some people actually do succeed and do really well with that. So some of the motivations for Adler. Growth is definitely not seen in stages. It's what he calls constellations. Go from there. Are either of these theories testable? Again, macro theories tend to be less testable. To really hard to get in there. But I've shown you some ways if we did some correlational stuff, and Adler did it and other people have done it since, that there do seem to be things about sibling and birth order, although you can also find people who disagree with the statistics. And that also some of the inferiority complex has been studied and seem to hold water, but definitely useful, definitely ways of thinking about a dynamic and trying to understand and make sense out of our world, which is what Adler and Erikson said motivates us and makes us go. So the last part of this particular chapter, the author throws in Erich Fromm, a big name in psychoanalytic theory, but interestingly enough, he became big because he tried to combine a social construct and a social idea like Marxism with psychoanalysis. He was really critical of democracy, especially Western democracy and capitalism, and felt that people were being led into feeling more um, powerless, alone, anxious, and insecure because of how we set up democratic, capitalistic types of ideas. Um, he felt like workers who produce stuff, but then give it away, it's sold, it's marketed, and they don't own it, become feel disconnected or alienated from their stuff. And he compares this to a more agrarian culture or a society in which what you're making, whether it be working the land and creating food for your own family, or creating furniture that you keep or that stays in your community. When you're making a chair in China and it's being shipped over to the United States, you really lose almost a spiritual connection to it. So if those of you who are familiar with Marxism definitely will see this in um, some of these ideas of how to wed Marxism and psychoanalysis. I want to just spend a little bit on Fromm's 8 needs because these are critical. These are things that really made Fromm kind of big, and I think help us understand his theory as it relates to character. He talks about 8 needs, and we're going to see that other theorists, other neo-Freudians also talk about 8 neurotic needs, strivings for things. So read through these and understand them a little bit. And if you think about a Modern Family episode, see if you can find different characters who might relate to one of these particular 8 needs, and send me a tweet. Select one, let me know which one you think. It also helped me make sure that I know you guys are paying attention as we go through these slides. So read through these, tweet at me one of these needs and the Modern Family character that you think they're working with. I'm also going to throw Oliver James here at the end. Has a couple of really interesting books. I would recommend the one on the right, which is The Selfish Capitalist. However, Affluenza is really good, and They F You Up, which is the title of a poem by Peter Larkin. They F you up, your mom and dad. They don't mean to, but they do. It's a great poem. You can look all of that up. I'll include some links to Oliver James talking at a book signing. His books are actually difficult to get in the United States, but I threw him in because he's really very similar to what Erich Fromm was saying in kind of the contemporary day. Both of his parents actually were therapists. I believe they were both analysts. And Oliver says that, the rates of depression, the rates of alienation, the rates of people really struggling with things are higher in these capitalist Western democratic societies because of, I think, the same things that Marxists would say, and certainly the same thing that Fromm was saying. So a couple of interesting links. If you're into that with Oliver James, go ahead and look them up. And that pretty much covers the theorists in Chapter 8 and the ideas about personality. Please do make sure you take a look at the links. I would have shown them in class, but they're harder to show on a Google Hangout because of copyright issues, and easier to do in the classroom because of the fair use in education types of laws. Tweet at me. Let me know what you think about the 8 needs and a Modern Family character. And I will see you when I get back. Take care.